Die cuts make our lives a lot easier, right? I mean, we can use them to cut out stamped images as well as create little embellishments for our cards. But did you know that you can use them to partially cut out stamped images? Now you are probably wondering, why in the world would we want to do that? Well, stick around and I will share 2 good reasons why. Hi, it's Lynn Dunn from Stamptastic Designs. Thanks so much for joining me today. In this episode of Stamptastic TV, I will share 2 beautiful card ideas featuring the partial die cutting technique. Now the cards showcase some images from the Good Morning Magnolia stamp set, and of course we will be using the Magnolia Memory die cuts that coordinate with this set. By the end of this video, you will have 2 beautiful card ideas featuring this fun die cutting technique. For the latest card making ideas, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on that little bell so you will be notified each time I upload a new video. Now, inquiring minds want to know, have you ever used a partial die cutting technique before? Drop me a comment below. Okay, so first let's talk about the supplies that were used to create these cards. Now you'll need some white and petal pink cardstock to create the base of the cards and for the accent pieces. You will also need some pattern papers. So for these cards, I am using some of the pattern paper from the Magnolia Lane Designer Series paper pack. And I'm also using some of the foil paper from the Royal Peacock Designer Series paper pack. But you can use any Designer Series paper that you choose. Now I will also be using the Good Morning Magnolia stamp set as well as the coordinating dies. Now I keep my dies inside my stamp set, so here's where they are. We're going to be using this large die today as well as the smaller die. Of course, you will also need some type of embossing machine so that we can do the cutting technique with the die cuts. We will also be doing a bit of coloring today, so I am going to be using some watercolor pencils. I will also show you how to use a blender pen so that we can blend and shade the color that comes from the watercolor pencils. We will also be using some ink, so we will be using Early Espresso and some black Memento ink. And the last thing we will be using are some pearls to embellish the card. Okay, I think that's it. Let's get started. Okay, so before we start making the cards, we need to talk a little bit about the partial die cutting technique. So die cutting requires the use of some type of embossing machine. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I will be using the Big Shot embossing machine, but keep in mind that this technique will work with any die cutting machine. Now, if you're familiar with die cutting, then you are probably familiar with the sandwich that you have to build in order to properly cut with the dies using your embossing machine. Now, the typical sandwich I use with the Big Shot embossing machine involves the use of a standard base, a thin die adapter, and yes, mine is well loved, and the use of 2 acrylic clear cutting plates. Now, the process for using dies with your particular embossing machine may be a little bit different, so be sure to check your manufacturer's recommendations. So first I will show you how to create a full die cut. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this, but bear with me. So you're going to start by creating the sandwich layers. So the first thing we're going to use is the standard platform. Then I'm going to add the thin die adapter and then one of the clear cutting plates. Then I'm going to lay my image directly on that cutting plate, and we're just going to use the large Magnolia image. And now you're going to take the die, so this is the cutting side, the one with the raised edge on it, and you're just going to lay that directly on top of the image and secure it with a bit of washi tape so it stays in place when you go to cut it. So we'll just add a little bit of washi tape there, and then a little bit here. Now we're going to lay the other clear cutting plate on top of this, and then we're going to run this through the Big Shot. And there you go. Now the partial die cutting technique involves the same type of die cutting process and the sandwich creation. The only difference is that when we apply the top cutting plate, we will be leaving a section of the die exposed. meaning that the top cutting plate will cover only part of the die, the part that we want to cut out. The rest of the die will be exposed. Now the embossing machine will only cut out this section of the cardstock, the section that is underneath this plate and the rest of the sandwich. It will not cut out this section. All right, so let's send it through the machine. Okay, so now instead of cutting out the entire flower, I've only cut out this part of the flower. So now I can take my scissors or a paper trimmer and just snip right up to this line. Let's flip this around. And we're gonna snip right up to this line. And now I have a partial die cut. So here is what the partial die cut piece of cardstock looks like. And here is what the full one looks like. Pretty cool, hey? And this technique works with any die cuts. So the possibilities really are endless. All right, now let's use this partial die cutting technique to create some fun cards. For more embossing techniques, click on the link featured at the top of the screen. So this first card features the large magnolia, and we're going to cut this magnolia right into the card front. So we're going to start with a piece of white cardstock cut at 5.5 by 8.5 inches. Score the 8.5 inch side at 4 1/4 inches to create the base of your card. Stamp the large magnolia image directly in the center of the card front using black ink. Color in the magnolia using watercolor pencils. So I decided to use watercolor pencils instead of markers so that the color doesn't bleed through this white cardstock. So start by using the Calypso Coral pencil to highlight different parts of the magnolia flower. Once you have finished highlighting the flower, use a blender pen to pull the color across the petals. This will give you a very subtle look on the ends of the petals and a darker, more shaded look on the inside or the lower section of the petals. Now add color to the leaves using the Old Olive watercolor pencil. You're going to be blending and pulling the color across the leaves, again using that blender pen. Now the blender pen will help eliminate those lines or streaks that you get when you color with pencils. Okay, so the last bit of coloring we're going to do is just coloring the stem with a little bit of early espresso, and again we're going to use the blender pen to blend and shade that color. For more watercolor pencil techniques, click on the link featured at the top of the screen. Okay, now we're ready to cut out the image using the partial die cutting technique. So start by creating the sandwich that I shared a little bit earlier. Lay the white cardstock with the magnolia flower image on the first cutting plate. Place the coordinating die cut over the image and secure it with a bit of washi tape. Lay the second cutting plate over the top of the die cut so that part of the flower is not covered by that top plate. So we are going to be using the die to cut off the part of the flower that is closest to the edge of the card front. The remainder of the flower will not be cut out. So once you have the top plate positioned where you want it, run it through the embossing machine. Now you can use a scissors or you can use your paper trimmer to cut off the excess cardstock. So if you are using a paper trimmer, just lay the card in the paper trimmer and line up the groove of the trimmer to where the die cut ends. You're going to cut from the top of the card to the cut made by the die. Now you're going to repeat this cutting on the bottom of the flower. Remove the excess piece of cardstock and you now have a partially die cut magnolia. Isn't it beautiful? Okay, now let's finish off the card with a few embellishments. Cut a 1 by 5.5 inch piece of patterned paper and adhere it on the inside of the card, slightly behind the card front edge so that it's visible behind the magnolia when the card front is closed. Stamp a sentiment on the inside of the card using early espresso ink. Then for the finishing touch, embellish the card front with a few pearls. There you go. You just created a beautiful partial die cut card. This technique works so good with this large magnolia. It's one of those cards that really packs that wow factor. And it was pretty easy, right? Okay, now that you have seen the partial die cutting technique in action, let's create another card with it. Now this time we're going to use the smaller flower image from the Magnolia set. So you will notice that this technique works with a large or a small die. All right, we're going to start with a piece of white cardstock cut at 5.5 by 8.5 inches. Score the 8.5 inch side at 4.25 inches to create the base of your card. Stamp the small Magnolia image on the upper right hand side of the card using black ink. Color in the Magnolia using some watercolor pencils. So again, we're going to use Calypso Coral to highlight different parts of the flower. We're going to add some color to the leaves using Old Olive, and then we're going to again use the Early Espresso to add color on the stem. Now go ahead and use the blender pen to spread the color in each of the areas of the flower. Okay, we're ready to cut out the image using the partial die cutting technique. So start by creating the embossing sandwich. Lay the white cardstock with the Magnolia image on the first cutting plate. Place the coordinating die cut over the image and secure it with a bit of washi tape. Lay the second cutting plate over the top of the die cut so that part of the flower is not covered by that top plate. Again, we are going to be using the die to cut off part of the flower that is closest to the edge of the card front. So once you have the top plate positioned where you want it, run it through the embossing machine. You will notice that part of the flower was cut with the die and the other part of the flower is intact on the card. Now we will finish off the card by cutting off the excess cardstock using a paper trimmer. All right, now let's decorate it. So cut a 1 by 5.5 inch piece of pattern paper and adhere it on the inside of the card so that it is flush with the edge. Cut another 1 by 5.5 inch piece of pattern paper. This time choose a different pattern that coordinates with the one you just used. Adhere this piece to the inside of the card so that it slightly overlaps onto the first piece. Stamp a sentiment on a scrap piece of white cardstock using Early Espresso ink. Cut out the image using a square punch or die cut. You could also just create a square shape with your paper trimmer. Then cut out a slightly larger square using a piece of petal pink cardstock. Adhere the two squares together and then secure it to your card front with a few dimensionals. Now I adhered my squares together so that they formed a diamond shape. But you don't have to use the diamond shape. You can use just the regular square. You could even use a circle or an oval. Now for the finishing touch, embellish the card front with a few pearls. So there you go. You just created another beautiful card with the partial die cutting technique. Isn't this fun? Now you have two beautiful Magnolia card ideas featuring the partial die cutting technique. And if you enjoyed the technique and these cards, feel free to download the printable tutorial. You can find the link in the description below this video. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by liking it and sharing it with your friends. And leave a comment below to let me know what you enjoyed most about the video and the project shared here today. Have fun getting creative, take care, and I'll see you soon.